All right. We're rolling, Bob.
Hello, my name is Mike Fonseca. I'm the president of the First Flight Society here in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina. Today we're going to be talking with Alfred Poor, one of our lifetime members. He has a fascinating story about his grandfather, and many people don't know this, but his grandfather was also Alfred Poor, and he is one of the designers of the monument at Kill Devil Hills, and is now part of the National Park Service. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Alfred Poor.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation to be here. This has been a lot of fun putting this together and digging through and finding out stuff about my grandfather that I thought might be of interest to folks. So
I'm very excited. This is something I personally wanted to learn about.
Cool. Well, let me take it away and share with you some things that a lot of people probably don't know. As you mentioned, my grandfather, Alfred Poor, is the designer of the Wright Brothers Memorial, which is the granite beacon at the park, as you mentioned. And it's a stunning piece of architecture, in my opinion. And it's a hallmark of the Wright brothers. But before I start talking about the monument and its history and how this all came to be, I'd like to start by reading from an article, the beginning of an article. And it goes like this. A little group of fishermen stood on the beach, watching the boat with curious interest. They were a queer bunch, these Newfoundland men, with their misshapen hip boots, their gaudy mackinaws, and their brilliantly colored toques. Although not one of them had ever seen an airplane before, they did not seem particularly surprised that our machine could fly. In fact, these unemotional people, who silently watched us as they puffed on old blackened and charred clay pipes, took us and the machine as a matter of course, and really only evinced that interest which they would show at the departure of one of their own fishing dories. Lewis, the head mechanic, had started to fuss with the engines early in the morning, and now it was about 3 p.m. He was at last satisfied with his handiwork. For a time, I watched him as his deft fingers made delicate adjustments on the carburetor, but this did not prove very entertaining for me, as Lewis was as grouchy as ever and answered my innocent questions in curt monosyllables. Roy, his helper and ardent admirer, proved no more interesting to talk to, for his conversation was limited to, "Oh boy, ain't them engines running sweet. Gee, they're some babies." And Pete was talking to the natives about the weather. He had a faculty for getting to be everybody's best friend in a remarkably short time. Before we'd been at Harbor Grace 3 days, all the fishermen called him Pete and asked and followed his advice upon subjects about which he knew nothing. However, such as the best way to keep fish nets from rotting, or what to do when baby was teething. However, even he was unable to break through the cast iron reserve of these imperturbable folk, for when he bade them cheerily goodbye, they only sucked harder upon their pipes and mildly suggested that we come back sometime in August when the fishing was better. After this peaceful leave-taking, Pete wandered over to where I was sitting in the cockpit of the machine. The weather, he informed me, would probably be fair on Sunday, with a fresh breeze from the northwest. In the few minutes that remained before the scheduled time of departure, he briefly outlined to me the plans of our trip. We would have the wind with us all the way, as we were in the region of the prevailing westerlies. This helping zephyr would be strongest at about 15,000 feet, so we would probably fly at that altitude most of the time, coming down to make observations. Now, that's how an article started, written by my grandfather, called A Flight Across the Atlantic. And it goes on to describe their flight. It took them 20 hours and 40 minutes, I believe it was, to fly nonstop from Newfoundland to Ireland. And the article was great. It was published in Flying Magazine in the August 1918 issue. You can go find a copy online. But it included a map of their route, which I find particularly interesting. It was a reproduction from a nautical map, because a nautical chart, because they didn't have aeronautical charts back then. But the thing that's particularly interesting is it worked out a direct line of flight that followed a great circle route. And he actually worked this out with his father, Charles Lane Poor, who was an astronomy professor with Columbia University. And his father was a sailor and an astronomer and was very interested in navigation, and actually went on to design some navigation tools to help navigate more accurately, both for marine and aeronautical use. So they worked out this direct line of flight from Newfoundland to Ireland to come up with a shortest distance crossing. His article goes on in great detail, talks about the destroyers that were stationed as sort of pickets across their route so that they could check in with them, about how they encountered a convoy of ships as they approached Ireland, talked about the scarcity of chicken sandwiches and how hungry he was. But it was a great trip. So the question is, why haven't you heard about this before? Well, we've heard about other nonstop transatlantic flights. There's Charles Lindbergh, who's the most famous. He flew across by himself. He had the solo flight. Some of you aviation history buffs may know about Alcock and Brown. They flew together nonstop across the Atlantic. But Alfred Poor and crew, where are they in the history books? Well, it's curious to figure out what's going on here, especially when you stop to think about when these flights took place. Lindbergh, as we probably all know, his flight from Long Island to Paris occurred in 1927. Alcock and Brown, they were 8 years earlier in 1919. But Alfred Poor's flight was published in a 1918 version of issue of Flying Magazine and occurred from July 28th to 29th. How can that be? Well, as it turns out, his article was fiction. It was scientific, truly science fiction or speculative fiction based on all the technology that was available at the time. This was a plausible story of what could actually have happened. It didn't, but he had all the details worked out. And one of the fascinating things is, if you look at Alcock and Brown's flight plan and their actual route of flight, it matches almost exactly the flight that my grandfather planned out. Furthermore, if you look at the flight that Lindbergh took, it started further west in Long Island in New York City and went a little further east to Paris. But if you put the route that he took on here, it almost exactly matches up with the route that my grandfather figured out. So that's kind of exciting to see how he foresaw how transatlantic flights were going to happen. So how did he come to be able to envision this historic flight, before it even happened? One more thing I want to mention. Charles Lindbergh, after he completed his flight, came and visited Charles Lane Poor, my grandfather's father, to talk about the navigation calculators that he was creating. And my father was there at the house when they met. So my father, when he was 8 years old, met Charles Lindbergh, which is kind of cool. So how did my grandfather come to know this about aviation and be so interested in it? Well, he actually got his flying license when he was a teenager. He learned on Long Island in a Curtiss F flying boat. And later in college, he wrote an extensive memoir about the process of learning to fly and the people he learned with, which makes some fascinating reading, which we hope someday to get published. But in any case, he learned very early on in the flying process. And it's interesting to note that his flying license was issued by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. And under their auspices, the Aero Club of America was authorized to grant pilots licenses to pilots. And so he got his hydroplane certificate in 1917 when he was 18 years old. And if you can see in the slide here, he had certificate number 77. So he had a 2-digit pilot's license. And for those of you who are aviation history buffs, you might find it of interest to see that his license was signed by Alan Hawley and his brother William Hawley, who were the founders of the Aero Club, but early aviation pioneers. So there's a bit of a touch of history in that. So he had his pilot's license. He went off to college, but World War I started, and he wanted to take part, but he was too young to enlist in the Navy. Fortunately, the records of his birth in Baltimore had all been destroyed in the fire. So with his father's permission and complicity, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Navy to become a naval pilot. And after a time as a cadet at MIT, was sent down to the Florida Keys to do his flight training. Among the aircraft that he flew in Florida was the HS-2 flying boat, which apparently had a bit of a squirrely, nasty reputation, but he delighted in showing people some of the things that it could do. So as an ensign in the Navy, he completed his flight training, but the war ended before he could go overseas. But the Navy kept him on and asked him to continue on as a check pilot because the Navy had decided that all the cadets who were enrolled in the program, when the war ended, they decided that they would let them continue and finish the program so that they could complete their training. And so they needed check pilots. And so my grandfather was one of the check pilots who helped these Navy cadets complete their training. Now, I'm sure a number of people on this program listening to this have experienced for themselves firsthand what it's like to be a check pilot. Aside from the potentially exciting takeoff and landings, there's usually a lot of boring time spent while the pilot goes through the paces. And my grandfather was no exception. He got bored, but he found that he could take a book up and do some reading while the pilots were going through their maneuvers. And he hit upon Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, if you have ever seen it, it's a rather weighty tome. And he discovered that it was not only interesting to read, but he found that this volume was most convenient because when a student froze on the controls, I could hit him over the head with the Gibbons and instill not only a knowledge of flying, but of a little Roman history. So he had a sense of humor as well. So he completed his service with the Navy and came out with the rank of ensign and went back to college, complete his college degree. And then one day he got a letter from a friend of his from elementary school. And the friend had gone to Harvard, his friend had gone to Yale, but his friend had been part of the Yale Flying Club. And he wrote to my grandfather and said, we've got the opportunity to purchase a Navy surplus airplane. And the Yale club agreed to buy it, but the club is now dissolved and there's no buyer. If we split the cost, your share would be $250, and we can keep it on Long Island for the summer, and we can take turns flying it, and it could be fun. So my grandfather jumped at the chance, ponied up the money, and off they went to the Philadelphia Naval Yard to pick up their airplane. So there they were, decked out with their straw boaters and their, white suits, and, dressed as dapper young men. And they arrived to find their airplane in 2 large crates, plus another crate for the engine, and everything slathered in cosmoline to keep it from rusting. So they quickly hired a truck to haul it down to Essington, which is on the Delaware, just south of where Philadelphia Airport is now. And one interesting side note to this is I believe that they took it to what is the float plane base there, which is where I also took one of my sailboats in years past when I needed to do some work on it and wanted it close by. So I didn't know at the time that I had this connection with that location. So they got there and they took off their fancy coats and their hats, their straw hats, and they started putting the thing together, and they got a mechanic to come help mount the engine and get it all set. And they knew it was going to be too heavy for them to carry their luggage and everything. So they packed up their coats and hats and got those all shipped back home. And then they went to take off, and they discovered that no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get the plane off the water with both of them on board. One person, it was fine, but couldn't get it off with both people. And so after consulting and figuring it out, they realized that the propeller had the wrong pitch. And so they contacted the factory and made arrangements for a replacement propeller to be sent. The problem is my grandfather had a job, so he had to leave and get back to work the next day, whereas his buddy could stick around in Philadelphia and wait for the propeller to arrive, which it did a week or so later. And they put the new propeller on, and it worked fine, and he was able to take off. And so he was getting prepared to fly from Philadelphia to Long Island. And as he was making his preparations, a man with a wooden leg came up to him on the dock. And he looked at the plane and he said, "Can this thing get me to New York?" And my grandfather's partner said, yeah, we could do that. He said, "I'll pay you $50 if you can get me to New York, because I've got an important meeting I've got to get to." And so the deal was struck. They got in the plane, they took off and headed for Long Island. And making the landing, there was a small confrontation with a stake on an oyster bed that didn't cause much damage, but made the landing a bit exciting. But they managed to get the flying boat pulled up on the ramp without too much of a incident, and all was fine, except apparently during all the excitement, the man with the wooden leg took off without paying. So the paid flight did not go quite as they'd hoped. Now, there are a couple punchlines to this story. And the first is the name of that partner of his, this grade school friend of his, was Juan Tripp, which some of you may recognize as the name of the founder of Pan American Airlines. And so this flight was Juan Tripp's first paid flight. And so you could argue that this was Pan Am flight number 1. And my grandfather owned half the plane. The other thing is, I'm pretty sure Tripp figured out that you should collect the fee before you take off rather than after you land. So probably shaped his view of how to run an airline after that. So in any case, the relationship between my grandfather and Juan Tripp continued long past that summer, sharing an airplane. Juan Tripp continued to, he built Pan Am and built an empire flying to South America. And my grandfather helped him. One of the things he helped do was he helped actually lay out some of the routes for the commercial flights for Pan American down to South America. A couple of interesting photos that come out of his collection. This is a picture of the terminal, Pan Am terminal in Havana. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that back then, the flying commercially like this was exciting, adventurous, exotic. It was a really big deal. But it wasn't particularly luxurious, as you can see here at the terminal that you'd land at in Havana. You go to San Juan, Puerto Rico, things get a little more sparse. So here's the departure and arrival deck at San Juan. But my favorite of all is Antigua. So here you are, your plane lands, it gets tied up to this little barge, which you get to share with the fuel tank, the drums of aviation fuel. And I see a rowboat in the picture. I don't know if they rowed the passengers ashore. Hopefully they had a motor launch at least that would come and give you a slightly more upscale ride. But my grandfather's participation was not limited to just helping figure out the routes. He also designed airports for Pan Am. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, the federal government had an airport of its own, and it was used by other airlines, but Pan Am wanted to have their own facilities. And so my grandfather designed the air terminal, and those were the blueprints. And this is a scale model of the terminal that he designed. Kind of a fancy and attractive looking structure. You can see the dock area down in the lower left, and the covered section was the ramp for the passengers to go from the terminal building down to the departures and arrivals. You'll notice another similarly covered walkway in the upper left-hand corner of the model. And that was because Pan Am also had land-based planes that used the terminal. So this was both for seaplanes and for land planes, which I think is kind of interesting. And then World War II came. And my grandfather was in the Naval Reserves, and he was called up into duty to serve as an inspector of naval aircraft. He was too old to fly in combat, so they used him in the U.S. to oversee production plants in Ohio and New Jersey and other places. And in particular, he was responsible for the production of the Grumman TBM Avenger, the torpedo bomber, which served a lot of duty in World War II. One interesting side note, his younger brother, Edmund, was one of the three founders of Grumman Aircraft. So there was a family connection in this as well. So he worked through the World War II, helping get these planes inspected and approved and off the line. This is the last TBM Avenger that came off the line in Trenton, 7,546. That's a lot of aircraft of one model. So it just gives you some sense of the scale of the wartime production back then. And in this photo, my grandfather is the one to the right in the naval uniform with the mustache. But this was his team that was responsible for inspecting the aircraft. And so he left the Navy as a commander and at the rank of commander. And I'll point out that he is probably one of the very few people who flew for the Navy in both World Wars. Back down in Key West as an ensign, getting his flight training, and then continuing as the Czech pilot. But then as a commander in World War II, he was in Pensacola for a while his son was going through Naval Air Cadet training. And he also got to take the same training while his son did. So he took training programs for the Navy in both World Wars. Too young to fight in the first, too old to fight in the second, but a pilot nonetheless. And so I imagine there are very, very few people who have that on their resumes. So after the Navy, he was an architect of some renown, not just the Wright Brothers Memorial, but he was the architect for the extension and renovation of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., which was a rather massive undertaking, to say the least. He continued to design airports, airfields. This was the Grumman Airfield in Calverton, New York, which I like this particularly because you can see his drawing on the left, the schematic for it, and the aerial photo on the right, showing how it all matches up. I think that's a lot of fun to see the comparison of the two. He also designed airfields for NATO. He had designed 2 airfields for NATO in France, for example. Among the other projects that he did as an architect, the Javits Federal Building was his design. That's in New York City. So people in Manhattan may be familiar with the building. But of course, the real labor of love was the Wright Brothers Memorial. And he entered the competition for the design. And this is actually a copy of the drawing that he submitted as part of the entry for the memorial's design. And when it was dedicated in November of 1932, there were a lot of notaries there who were in attendance for it, but one in particular who I'd like to single out, and that is Orville Wright himself was there at the dedication. And another tie to Kitty Hawk, my first flight is a narrative poem that was written by John Williams Andrews. And this is a copy that I have from my grandfather's papers that was autographed by him, saying, "For Alfred Easton Poor, who also has this stake in Kitty Hawk," and then the author. So that's neat. But I think the author, the signature that I treasure the most is on a letter from Orville Wright. "Dear Commander Poor, I thank you for the framed photograph of the Wright Memorial at Kitty Hawk, which came in last week. I had not seen one like it. The clouded sky is very effective in bringing out the lines of the monument. I am very pleased to have this photograph. If your duty should bring you near Dayton, I would be happy to see you. Sincerely yours, Orville Wright." So the Wright Brothers Memorial is certainly a large part of my grandfather's legacy, but I think you now hopefully will have an appreciation of how much more there was to him than just this one design. Proud to carry his name. Also, probably the last pilot, licensed pilot in the family, though I'm sure there will be more in the future. And so that's what I have to tell you about my grandfather.
Well, that's fascinating, Alfred. I think this is a gentleman a lot of people don't know anything about, and you can see what a great history he's had with aviation, as well as with architecture and the monument down in Kitty Hawk, Kill Devil Hills. North Carolina. Yeah, that's one I think confuses people. It was Kitty Hawk at the time. There was no Kill Devil Hills, but now where it's located is the town of Kill Devil Hills. So sometimes we kind of use it interchangeably, even though they're two different towns. But if we're going to talk in historical terms, it's Kitty Hawk. So we're correct on that. Yeah, I think this is great what you've shared. And what's also nice is that, you being a lifetime member is we still have that relationship, with the Poor family and the First Flight Society. So I really appreciate your time today, and we'll continue our celebration here. 117th anniversary, December 17, 1903 was the big day.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much
for inviting me. I'm just honored to have the chance to be a part of the celebration.